The geopolitical ground beneath our feet is shifting. What was unthinkable just 5 years ago has now become the extraordinary, dangerous new normal. 80 years. For 8 decades, the security of Europe, the peace, the prosperity, the very idea of the West, has rested upon a single unshakable foundation, the absolute, unwavering security guarantee of the United States of America. That foundation, viewers, is shattered. Friedrich Merz, the head of Germany's influential Christian Democratic Union, stood before the global community and delivered a message so sharp, so brutally honest, that the shock waves are still radiating outward. He declared, without reservation, that the era of Pax Americana, the security umbrella that defined the post-war world, is unmistakably clear. It is over. Finished. Kaput. This isn't just an observation. It is a seismic political and military declaration, echoing through the halls of every European capital, demanding immediate, drastic change. The realization didn't happen overnight. This dangerous new reality unfolded slowly through years of transatlantic strain and culminated in Russia's hostile military action in Ukraine. The frustration in Berlin and Paris is palpable. They watched as the debate in Washington became increasingly isolationist, increasingly distracted by the high-value competition with China, increasingly unreliable as a consistent partner. Merz and his contemporaries are now forced to confront a world where America might simply choose to step back, or worse, condition its support on political whims thousands of miles away. This sudden strategic vacuum has forced a massive, costly, and immediate hardening of European defense policy. The stakes are dangerously high. The implication of Merz's statement is that Europe can no longer afford the luxury of dependency. It must stop simply outsourcing its survival to Washington. When these European leaders speak of the end of Pax Americana, they are not just lamenting history. They are fired back a warning squarely aimed at the volatile political currents in Washington. They feel abandoned, frustrated, and deeply exposed. The core truth is that Europe must now assume responsibility for its own existential defense, whether it is ready or not. And the clock is ticking on a massive escalation that could draw NATO, or a newly fortified European defense alliance, into a direct conflict with Moscow. What Merz demands is nothing less than the raw force of political will to fundamentally restructure the European continent's approach to war and peace. We are watching the creation of a new, independent European shield, a massive military complex designed not just to supplement NATO, but to stand on its own feet. This effort demands hundreds of billions in new spending, a terrifying acceleration of arms production, and the stark acceptance that Europe is now its own primary target. This is a daring political move, but necessary. They refuse to be intimidated. They are orchestrating a new unified front, preparing a resolute response to any future hostile military action, defining a new red line that Russia cannot ignore. Merz's statement is a definitive sign of geopolitical retaliation against the perception of American retreat. It is the sound of 80 years of dependency being snapped. The world we knew, where the U.S. provided the blanket protection, is gone. Europe is arming itself, urgently and fundamentally. The new reality is this. Europe is alone, and its leaders are preparing for a confrontation they desperately hope to avoid, but know they must win. This extraordinary shift is arguably the most significant geopolitical reorientation since the fall of the Soviet Union. The question remains, can Europe build its own shield fast enough before the next dangerous phase of escalation begins? The stakes are too high to be wrong. This is the new, solitary, and heavily armed Europe. The global divorce is upon us, and it is extraordinary. For generations, the security architecture of the West was premised on one immutable fact: the guarantee of American protection. That premise has dangerously crumbled. The warning shot wasn't fired recently. The process unfolded over years, a slow, agonizing realization in Brussels and Berlin that the promise was becoming a liability. When the highest echelons of American power openly questioned the sanctity of Article 5, Europe knew the Pax Americana was structurally finished. This was the moment of rupture, the clear signal that the shield was lowering. And how did Washington respond to the legitimate fears of its allies? They fired back, not at their rivals, but at the very nations they swore to protect. The rhetoric coming from Capitol Hill and the White House has been unmistakably clear. Pay up or be abandoned. This sharp pivot toward transactional security, echoing the darkest days of isolationism, forced Europe's hand completely. They were forced to stare into the abyss of a world without a dependable superpower guardian. The political reality that emerged as the raw force of political will applied to self-preservation. It is a hardening, a complete mental break from reliance on the U.S. strategic umbrella. This realization sends shock waves far beyond NATO's borders, extending the new European gaze eastward, dangerously towards Beijing. This is Section 2, the global divorce. The painful split isn't just about defense budgets. It's about sovereign destiny. Europe's economic viability depends on global trade, and when Washington began orchestrating intense friction, threatening tariffs and even hostile military action against rivals, Europe found itself squarely in the geopolitical crosshairs. The fury across key European capitals is palpable. They feel abandoned, strategically manipulated, and desperately frustrated by the demand to choose sides in a conflict they did not start. Europe is now engaged in a high-value, daring balancing act. They must secure their supply chains and their independence from both the U.S. and China simultaneously. They cannot afford to be intimidated by threats from either side. This requires a resolute response, drawing a new red line that emphasizes European autonomy above all else. The stakes are escalating daily. Consider the immediate security environment. Russia remains an existential threat. The Middle East is a volatile powder keg. And yet, Europe is forced to dedicate immense resources not just to defense, but to creating entirely new transatlantic mechanisms, because the old ones are hollowed out. The speed required for this transformation is terrifying. This forced autonomy is accelerating industrial strategy and domestic defense production at a pace that is frankly extraordinary. They are no longer waiting for American hardware. They are building their own. France and Germany, the engine room of the continent, are pushing forward with integrated defense initiatives that bypass Washington entirely, a move that would have been unthinkable just 5 years ago. This is retaliation, not just a policy shift. Retaliation against the decades of being taken for granted and against the recent sharp abandonment. The new European mindset understands that reliance equals vulnerability. They cannot afford to be caught again in the crossfire of America First policy swings. The Merz warning, that Pax Americana is over, is fundamentally a declaration of independence. Europe is building its own shield, designed to protect them from Beijing's overreach, Moscow's aggression, and critically, from Washington's dangerous unpredictability. The escalation is unavoidable now. Europe is armed, solitary, and ready to set its own course. The global realignment is fully underway, and the consequences will define the next 50 years. This divorce will prove to be one of the most consequential strategic shifts in modern history. The time for deliberation is over. The time for action is now. The geopolitical transformation now unfolding is nothing short of extraordinary. The long-anticipated divorce from American military hegemony has forced Europe's hand, pivoting the continent toward a future that is undeniably dangerous and defined by self-reliance. For 70 years, the shield was provided. Now, the European capitals are scrambling to build their own. The realization is sharp, the budgetary commitments are real, and the intentions are unmistakably clear. Europe is entering a new, high-stakes arms race for strategic autonomy. The numbers alone send shock waves across the globe. We are talking about Europe's $1 trillion defense pledge, a quantum leap in military spending designed not just to plug existing gaps, but to construct a deterrent force capable of meeting any near-peer adversary head-on. This isn't bureaucratic shuffling. This is the raw force of political will, echoing through the halls of Brussels, Paris, and Berlin. This unprecedented financial commitment signals a hardening of European policy toward hostile powers. It means moving production of high-value munitions, advanced air defense systems, and next-generation strategic missiles from concept to rapid deployment. The atmosphere is tightening dangerously. Every strategic announcement, every joint procurement agreement, is an act of calculated escalation in this new great power competition. The continent is weaponizing its economy. Who is this colossal shield being built against? The answer lands squarely on those nations accused of orchestrating destabilization and hostile military action near Europe's frontiers. European leaders are furious, not just at the geopolitical necessity, but at the sheer scale of this spending at a time of domestic financial strain. But necessity, they argue, trumps comfort. We are watching a daring strategic move, a bet that rapid rearmament will secure peace, rather than provoke the very war it intends to avoid. They believe building systems of high value, particularly advanced integrated deterrence architecture, is the only way forward. Europe is laying down a very public red line. Do not mistake the perceived complexity of EU bureaucracy for strategic weakness. The response to any breach of sovereignty, any perceived act of aggression, will be a resolute response. Those powers that once believed Europe could be easily intimidated or strategically frustrated are quickly realizing their profound miscalculation. The threat of immediate and overwhelming retaliation now underpins every diplomatic exchange and every strategic planning document drafted in the Union's capital cities. The scramble for strategic autonomy is now the primary directive. This mandate means severing dependence not only on the American security architecture, but also on global supply chains that proved dangerously brittle during recent crises. The focus is shifting dramatically from costly, decades-long expeditionary warfare to swift continental defense, fortifying the frontier with sophisticated layered defenses. We are seeing immediate, massive investments in long-range precision strike capabilities, electronic warfare dominance, and sophisticated hypersonic missile defense, technologies that define the modern battlefield and provide strategic depth. This pivot is causing immediate friction within NATO, where some members, particularly those reliant on established U.S. commitments, view Europe's independent push as fracturing the alliance. Others, however, see it as the only viable path to collective security, recognizing that the U.S. commitment is now conditional, perhaps fleeting. The existential stakes are impossibly high. If this massive rearmament effort fails to materialize quickly, or if internal political divisions derail the funding and deployment mechanisms, the resulting window of vulnerability could invite the exact type of aggressive hostile military action Europe is desperately attempting to deter. This is a continental gamble of epic proportions, a strategic bet defining whether Europe remains a playground for great power competition or successfully emerges as a resilient strategic pole in its own right. The old world order hasn't just fractured, it has been violently pulverized. The debris is settling, revealing a heavily armed, newly autonomous Europe ready to fight for its own survival. The military-industrial complex across the continent is now humming at wartime levels. Production lines are being repurposed with unprecedented speed. Civilian technology is being militarized. This is not a slow strategic shift. This is a strategic sprint powered by furious political desperation. The trillion-dollar question is whether Europe can build the shield fast enough before the next great global conflict is intentionally or accidentally triggered. The clock, my friends, is ticking down to zero. The clock, my friends, is ticking down to zero. And as the global clock speeds toward midnight, the most extraordinary and dangerous transformation is unfolding inside the reluctant giant of Europe, Germany. We are witnessing the German reckoning, a historic, profound pivot away from decades of cautious pacifism and toward a full-throttle military-industrial buildup led by Friedrich Merz. This isn't just policy. This is the raw force of political will unleashed, echoing the darkest imperatives of survival. Merz and the CDU have fired back against the perceived American retreat with a sharp, unmistakable demand for sovereignty through military might. His blueprint is simple, yet revolutionary. Germany must transition from an economic powerhouse dependent on American defense to a military-industrial powerhouse capable of projecting and defending its own interests across the continent. This means moving far beyond the mere 2% NATO spending target. Merz is demanding a permanent structural commitment to rearmament that rebuilds the defense sector into a core driver of the German economy. We are talking about billions upon billions directed toward domestic arms production, tank factories, and missile systems. This is the highest value strategic reversal Germany could possibly make, shifting budget lines, supply chains, and political priorities overnight. This hardening of German policy isn't theoretical. It is manifesting dangerously in every sphere of public life. The deepest shockwaves hit when Merz and his allies announced the daring move to bring back mandatory military or civil service, conscription, for all young adults. Think about the scale of that change. For a generation raised on peace dividends and the comfort of American security, this is a seismic reality check. This is an immediate, operational escalation signaling that Germany expects to field large, trained forces. This isn't about peacekeeping. This is about war-fighting readiness. It is the clearest, most visceral sign that Berlin views the current geopolitical crisis not as a temporary phase, but as a permanent state of threat that requires national mobilization. When you prepare for war, you must assume war is coming, and the world is watching this preparation with furious intensity. Russia, already frustrated by Western unity, views this German rearmament as the ultimate betrayal, squarely accusing Berlin of orchestrating a revival of hostile military action planning against Eastern Europe. Moscow has repeatedly stated that supplying long-range missiles to Ukraine or allowing German bases to become launch points for retaliation against Russian territory crosses a critical red line. They will not be intimidated. This German awakening guarantees escalation. The risks of accidental conflict or deliberate retaliation by proxies multiply exponentially the moment Berlin commits to becoming the military provider of last resort for the rest of Europe. Merz and his government have chosen this path because they believe the only alternative is eventual submission. They are calculating that the cost of building this shield, the economic strain, the political fight over conscription, the increased danger of being targeted, is far less than the cost of strategic weakness in a world where the United States is pulling back. This isn't just about Germany. This is the engine driving the entire continent's shift. If Germany rearms, the rest of the EU must follow, or risk becoming strategically irrelevant, caught between a demanding, militarized Germany and an aggressive, expansionist Russia. The stakes are dangerously high, and Merz's resolute response dictates that Europe is now fully committed to building its own defense architecture. The age of Pax Americana is truly over, and the German reckoning has only just begun. The question now is whether this new European shield will be used solely for defense, or if the frustration built up over decades of security dependence will fuel preemptive actions, dragging the West further into the vortex of great power competition. We are watching the countdown. The countdown isn't just about European arms factories spinning up production. It is about the dangerous erosion of the bedrock of Western security, NATO itself. This collapse has been slow, systemic, but now it is extraordinarily visible. We are witnessing the decay of Article 5, the central commitment, turned into a geopolitical fiction. The Trump shadow looms large, casting a pall of total uncertainty over Brussels and every allied capital. His rhetoric, sharp, confrontational, and unmistakably clear, has fundamentally redefined the alliance, turning the principle of collective defense into a transactional protection racket. When a sitting or aspiring U.S. president openly questions whether to honor the defense of allies who are not spending enough, the shock waves hit every capital from Warsaw to Tallinn. The security architecture didn't just bend, it cracked. This is the essence of NATO's lame duck status, an alliance paralyzed by the unpredictable, unilateral will of its central guarantor. But the most terrifying element of this strategic shift concerns the nuclear umbrella. For 75 years, that American commitment was the ultimate deterrent. Now, the mere suggestion that the U.S. might stand down, might leave Europe naked against a nuclear-armed aggressor, has forced a dangerous, immediate calculation. Europe is staring into the abyss of possible nuclear escalation, realizing that if the U.S. retreats, the only credible red line against total defeat is their own, newly forged, raw force of political will and military capability. This vulnerability is not just frustrating. It is a profound existential crisis for Europe's sovereignty and survival. What good is Article 5 if the guarantor is unwilling to risk Washington, D.C. for Vilnius? The consensus is hardening across Europe. Article 5, the core pillar of mutual defense, is rapidly becoming a hollow promise. It's a beautifully worded treaty provision without the accompanying, resolute response of political muscle. Allies feel intimidated, yes, but more importantly, they are furious and deeply frustrated. They see hostile military action being orchestrated right on their borders, and the threat of meaningful, collective retaliation is dissolving under layers of transatlantic doubt. The current geopolitical picture unfolded a crisis where the United States is pulling away and Russia is pressing harder. The vulnerability is too high value to ignore. This vacuum is why the warnings from leaders like Merz are echoing across the continent. Europe is being forced to take extraordinary, daring risks. They are rebuilding their shield not simply as an enhancement to NATO, but increasingly as an alternative to a NATO paralyzed by internal division and outside pressure. They are putting the responsibility for their security squarely on their own shoulders. If the United States steps back, believing that this is merely a squabble over defense spending ratios, they are fatally miscalculating the new reality. Europe's desperation is fueling a massive sovereign rearmament, and history proves that desperation does not lead to measured peacekeeping. It leads to daring, swift action. The political ground has shifted. The world watched as the Pax Americana security structure faltered. Europe has now fired back at the threat of abandonment. They are aiming at more than just deterring Russia. They are aiming at a world where they, and they alone, control their destiny. The era of the American nuclear security blanket is ending. The period of dangerous European autonomy, and the potential for immediate, violent escalation, has just begun. The fundamental question of whether this new European shield is purely defensive is now irrelevant. If challenged, Europe will use it with the raw force of a continent finally taking back its own security. That is the new, terrifying truth driving global conflict projections. The political climate is demanding a resolute response, but the response will no longer be dictated solely by Washington. The geopolitical earthquake triggered by this shift has been truly extraordinary. The transition away from the certainty of Pax Americana is not a slow, negotiated retirement. It is a violent, structural break, tearing the fabric of the Western alliance apart. We are watching a dangerous dynamic unfold right before our eyes. When German leadership issued its declaration, uncompromising, stark, and unmistakably clear, they were drawing the battle lines of a new world order. The immediate reaction from Washington has been swift and sharp. American diplomats and military planners have fired back, accusing Europe of willfully fracturing the very alliance structure designed to manage global threats. This isn't a diplomatic spat. This is the painful, public dissolution of 70 years of shared doctrine. The United States is furious. They are deeply frustrated that their strategic withdrawal is being met not with loyalty, but with continental audacity. They view this European pivot as an act of calculated betrayal, a high-value political and economic challenge deserving of swift retaliation. The crisis is escalating dangerously. Europe's new posture is hardening, driven by the raw force of political will demanding self-sovereignty. The shock waves from this German-led initiative are radiating globally, echoing the sentiment that the era of Western unilateralism is truly done. Every major power bloc, Beijing, Moscow, Tehran, is closely watching this internal fracturing, calculating how to best exploit the momentary vacuum of leadership. The world is becoming multipolar by European decree. This new continental wall is the ultimate red line. If challenged, Merz has signaled that the response will be a resolute response, no longer diluted by transatlantic consensus. The fear in the capitals of the old guard is palpable. They worry that a frustrated and potentially desperate American administration might resort to orchestrating economic chaos or sanction regimes designed to destabilize the European project. The rhetoric has moved beyond trade disputes. We are talking about measures that approach hostile military action in their economic severity. Merz and those backing him are squarely facing this existential pressure. They refuse to be intimidated. They know that this daring move to build a self-sufficient shield means they must prove that Europe's defenses are not just paper commitments, but functional, resilient deterrents. If Europe falters now, it guarantees an immediate and furious response from rivals looking to exploit the power vacuum. This is the ultimate test of continental resolve. The implications are overwhelming. Consider the consequences if a European nation, acting alone under the protection of this new continental shield, draws a line, say, over strategic African trade routes or crucial territorial waters, and that line is crossed by a major world power. The military escalation would be instantaneous, and the burden of de-escalation would fall solely on Brussels and Berlin, without the predictable backing of the U.S. Seventh Fleet. This is the perilous freedom that Europe has chosen. The key players in Washington see this shift not just as a security challenge, but as a profound economic threat, challenging the dollar's global supremacy. They believe the Europeans are using this new security framework as cover for an unprecedented economic shift that will destabilize the entire architecture of global finance. This is why the counter-rhetoric is so confrontational, so charged with the language of betrayal. The United States is not used to being challenged by its own historical allies. The warnings Merz issued, that Pax Americana is fundamentally over, are now unfolding in real time, brutally, across the Atlantic divide. We are witnessing the birth pangs of a truly independent European superpower, one that accepts the dangerous reality that its self-reliance will provoke confrontation. This is the cost of security. This is the price of sovereignty. And the world holds its breath, waiting for the first kinetic exchange that proves whether this new shield is impenetrable or merely a flimsy declaration. The next 6 months will determine whether the North Atlantic Treaty Organization survives in any meaningful capacity, or whether it becomes a historical footnote in the dawn of this multipolar world.